April 1945. The world was watching as Nazi Germany faced its final days. 6 years of war had left Europe in ruins, and the empire that once conquered nations was now surrounded by enemies, closing in from every direction. From the west, Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany. From the east, millions of Soviet soldiers prepared for the final assault on Berlin. Beneath the city, Adolf Hitler hid inside the Führerbunker, refusing to accept that the war was already lost. Above him, Berlin burned. Streets that once showed the power of the Third Reich had become a battlefield. But this was more than a fight between armies. Millions of civilians were trapped in the destruction, hiding underground as the final battle approached. The end of Nazi Germany had begun, and the last battle for Berlin would decide the fate of Europe. The collapse of Germany was happening faster than anyone expected. From the west, Allied forces pushed across the German countryside, moving through towns and cities that had been destroyed by years of war. American and British troops advanced with overwhelming power. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft moved together toward the heart of Germany. For German soldiers, the war had completely changed. The army that once marched across Europe was now fighting a desperate retreat. Behind the front lines, civilians faced the terrible aftermath of the fighting. Entire towns were damaged, and millions of people were left searching for safety. Above the battlefield, Allied aircraft controlled the skies, making Germany's ability to continue the war disappear piece by piece. The Western Front was collapsing. But while the Allies advanced from the west, an even larger force was approaching from the east. The final battle for Berlin was getting closer. While Allied forces pushed from the west, an even larger army was moving toward Berlin from the east. After years of brutal fighting, the Soviet Union prepared one final offensive to destroy what remained of Nazi Germany's defenses. Across frozen roads and ruined battlefields, millions of Soviet soldiers advanced with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces behind them. Their target was Berlin. Commanders carefully planned the attack, knowing the capture of the German capital would decide the fate of the war in Europe. Then the offensive began. A massive storm of artillery fire ripped through German positions as Soviet forces pushed forward through smoke, mud, and destruction. For German soldiers, the situation had completely changed. The army that once conquered across Europe was now fighting a desperate battle to slow the inevitable. Every mile brought the Soviet army closer to Berlin, and behind the city's walls, the final battle of the Third Reich was waiting. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet army had reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city that once represented the power of Nazi Germany was now surrounded by enemy forces, closing in from every direction. Inside Berlin, German troops prepared their final defenses. Barricades were built, weapons were gathered, and exhausted soldiers waited for an attack they knew was coming. The streets of the capital had become a battlefield. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble as the fighting moved closer to the center of the city. For civilians trapped inside Berlin, there was nowhere left to escape. Families crowded into underground shelters as the sounds of war grew louder above them. The Soviet army continued tightening the circle around the capital. The final assault on Berlin was about to begin. By late April 1945, the battle for Berlin had begun. The Soviet army pushed deeper into the city, fighting through streets that had become a maze of rubble and destruction. German defenders prepared their final resistance, using buildings, barricades, and anything they could find to slow the advance. Every street became a battlefield. Soldiers fought block by block as the heart of Nazi Germany collapsed around them. For the people trapped inside Berlin, the battle brought unimaginable suffering. Homes were destroyed, families were separated, and the city that once represented power was reduced to ruins. The Soviet advance continued toward the center of Berlin, and one building became the symbol of the final struggle for Nazi Germany, the Reichstag. Deep beneath the streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler remained inside the Führerbunker as the city collapsed around him. Every report brought more bad news. Soviet troops were closing in, German defenses were crumbling, and entire units had vanished from the battlefield. Inside the bunker, generals searched their maps for a way to save a war that could no longer be won. Radio operators worked around the clock, sending desperate orders to forces that were already surrounded or destroyed. Above them, constant artillery shook the city. Every explosion brought the Red Army closer to the bunker itself. Hitler still refused to surrender. As Berlin burned above, the final hours of the Third Reich were slipping away. Soon, the battle would reach the very heart of Nazi Germany. The Reichstag had become the final symbol of Nazi Germany's power. As Soviet forces closed in, the fighting grew more intense. Every street, every room, and every staircase became part of the battle. German defenders fought desperately, hoping to delay the inevitable for just a little longer. After days of relentless fighting, Soviet troops reached the Reichstag. The building that had once represented German authority now stood shattered by war. The battle was nearly over. Berlin had fallen, and with it, the Third Reich was on the edge of collapse. But one final chapter still remained: the fate of Adolf Hitler himself. By the end of April 1945, the war in Berlin was over. Inside the Führerbunker, the leadership of Nazi Germany faced a reality they could no longer escape. The capital had fallen, the army was collapsing, and there was no path to victory. Across the city, Soviet troops secured government buildings and key positions. Resistance faded as German forces realized the war was lost. One by one, soldiers surrendered. Weapons were abandoned, orders went unanswered, and the machine that had driven Germany's war effort finally came to a halt. News of Germany's collapse spread quickly across Europe. For millions of people, the end of the war was finally within reach. But after 6 years of destruction, victory would reveal a continent forever changed. After 6 years of war, the guns across Europe finally began to fall silent. In May 1945, Germany surrendered, ending the war on the European continent. Across cities and villages, millions celebrated the moment they had been waiting for. Soldiers returned home, families reunited, and people finally saw a future beyond destruction. But victory came with a terrible cost. Entire cities had been destroyed, millions of lives were lost, and Europe was left facing the enormous task of rebuilding. Prisoners returned, refugees searched for homes, and nations began the long process of recovery. The war was over, but the world it created would never be the same. The final question remained: what lessons would humanity carry forward from the most devastating conflict in history? The war in Europe was finally over, but the damage it left behind would shape the world for generations. Across the continent, millions returned to cities that no longer looked like home. Families searched for loved ones. Refugees searched for safety, and nations faced the impossible task of rebuilding. The cost of victory was measured not only in destroyed buildings, but in the lives lost on every side of the conflict. Memorials were created to remember those who never returned, and the world began asking how such a devastating war could ever happen again. Slowly, cities rose from the ruins. Streets were rebuilt, communities returned, and Europe began a new chapter. World War II ended in 1945, but its lessons remain. The final battle was over. The memory of those who lived through it would last forever. History is built from the stories of those who lived through it. If you want to discover more untold moments from the past, subscribe and join us for the next chapter of history, because the stories of yesterday should never be forgotten.